All right, if people could take their seats, we'll go ahead and start. We'd like to welcome everyone tonight, and to those who we're live streaming. So welcome to anyone who's watching at home as well, or in the future. We'll go ahead and begin with an opening prayer by Commissioner Jeff Knighton.
Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for this day, and we're thankful for the opportunity that we have to be gathered together. We're grateful to live in this community. We're grateful for the people that live in this community, and the opportunity that we have to work together to provide a positive future and for the community. And we pray that we will be wise in the decisions that we make, and that we will be able to take into account the thoughts and feelings of the members of the community, and that together we can make this a great place for all the residents here now and in the future, and pray for peace and safety in our community. And this we pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you. Okay. Well, we're grateful to have so many of you here with us tonight. We're going to go ahead and have a presentation of the form-based code of our city center. We're really excited to be talking about our future city center. And go ahead and we'll start with Morgan in that presentation, and then where's Jake? And then we'll follow it up with a presentation by Jake, our city manager. And after which we'll have comments by the commission and the council. And then we'll open it up for public comment for anybody who's here tonight to make some comments. And we'll just go to that point. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Well, good evening, planning commissioners and mayor and members of the city council. It's fun to be able to get together on these kind of for these special meetings. And this is a special project. I know this is something that we've touted as kind of the jewel of the city, and something that a ton of planning has gone into from the planning commission and from the years past. So really my goal today is to provide an informative presentation of what the code is. So this code, just so you know, this is not a proposed code. This is an adopted code, a code that has already been approved. And the hope is that we can see it be implemented and built out so it meets the goals and the objectives of the city. And one thing, we did just adopt our general plan. Sorry, I've got kind of a robotic.
Yes, I don't know. If you can make sure your microphones are off, well, that would be great.
Maybe I'll keep mine down, but they won't hear me. We'll figure it out. So what I was saying, this code is something that has already been adopted and approved, and then the hope is that we can see this implement, because as you study planning, all great cities have a downtown. They have a center. A downtown is something that gives a city a sense of identity. It's a gathering place, and this was anticipated for a long time. I wanted to provide just a little bit of history of the project. Back in 2009, May 13, 2009, Mayor Farmworth, the mayor at the time, he signed into law the ordinance that adopted basically the first downtown type plan. This was during the time when we initially started working to get a frontrunner station in Vineyard. The city had the forethought to know that transit was going to be very crucial to how we develop as a city and how we get around. And it was a really important investment. And so the idea was to create a special place around that transit station and to help create a downtown. I won't read every one of these, but these were the purpose statements of that time that provided the framework for what the downtown was supposed to be then, and it also provided the roots and kind of what it's supposed to be now. So there's been some changes. So it was to encourage high quality, compact development and increase the number of residents and workers within walking distance of transit opportunities. So that was the idea of having people close to where they were going, so that we can reduce the amount of driving. Encourage a mix of high quality residential, office, commercial, live, work space. So a lot of different uses. So the idea of mixing the uses was very important. Coordinating the urban design and streetscape elements in order to create a distinct visual quality for the area. And I put that in red to make it stand out. But that was very important back then, and it's important now, that this not just be any development that you would see somewhere in Utah County, but that this is something that is distinct and is very truly a vineyard type downtown, and so that's important. And also, as I'm sure as many of you are here today, parking, our favorite topic in the city, but it's important that we manage parking and that we manage access into the site. That's another reason why transit is so crucial to the site, and that we enhance the pedestrian experience. And then below that last one kind of continues with the making it a safe and attractive and comfortable environment for pedestrians and bicyclists. So that was very important back then. And then in 2015, September 23rd, Mayor Farnworth then signed into law what we have now, the Town Center Form-Based Code. So this was basically the city's attempt to kind of take this to the next level. And this is when the code changed from what we in the zoning world call it Euclidean zoning, where you talk more about like what the use of the property is going to be, to what the look and design, the form of the property. And so that's why it's a form-based code. It's a very important distinction. And these are some of the elements, the framework of our code now, to create a destination. And I think that's a really important part and a key to our future economically as well, is that we're not just a place that's nice for our residents, but it's a place where people from the region will want to come and visit. And I thought this word is very important. It's a village with a strong transit emphasis. So as you can imagine, like a village where you get to know each other, and that's our logo, staying connected as a city. And that's kind of what that whole village concept brings out. Superb park and trail systems. So you look at the code, there's a lot of open space trails that interconnect. Being a transit-oriented village, so the village being centered around the transit station, and a mix of uses. That's important for that village concept. And all the districts being tied together with great walkable streets. And that's one thing that, if you look at cities that are like hard to walk in, that feel disjointed, that don't really have a sense of community, oftentimes those are cities where the districts are very different and they're not tied together, and they're almost, it's kind of a confusing land use system. So this code anticipated having a really cohesive development that all tied together. And then the lake promenade, stretching from the station to the lake. That's such an important part because that frames and provides really the skeleton to the system, but also it puts the emphasis on the pedestrian. And that's very different than most developments throughout Utah. This is going to be designed to be about the pedestrian experience. You'll be able to drive there, but once you get out of your car, you have a safe walking environment. These are a few examples of what an urban village is. Some people are like, "Oh, what is that?" It's kind of it's a planning term, but I pulled from some examples that I liked. This one's in North Texas on the top left. You can see a urban plaza area, and then your building forms pulled up to the street. You'll notice a lot of trees, and so these are very common. This is very similar with our town center idea. And then at the bottom right is Daybreak in South Jordan. That's a lower density type mixed use village, but there are some core higher density areas, a Main Street area, some mixed uses. That's a great example if you want to see sort of what we're anticipating, some of the similar land uses. I definitely go visit Daybreak. And then I used to live in Virginia. I love Shirlington Village in Arlington. It's amazing. You ever go to DC, definitely spend some time walking around there. But these are some of the concepts that we think of when that'll help you kind of to imagine what the town center is supposed to be. The town center is made up of several districts, sub-districts. So you have the parent district, which is the town center, and then underneath it are several sub-districts. The town center station, that's the red on the bottom right, that's the most intense. The most intense because that's going to be the one that's served primarily by the transit station, and it'll be right up against it. On the west side of Main Street is the town center mixed use, also intense, but it does drop off a little bit. It's if you look at the heights that are allowed, the heights do drop off in that. Whereas in the town center station, there's not a height limit. You can build a 200-story structure if you want. I don't think anyone will, but it does. It's just truly a downtown type environment, and that was what it was supposed to be. With the mix of uses, and then as you go up, the village office is what you would see in kind of I wouldn't say a standard office park, but an office park type environment that's more of an urban office park. So buildings pulled up to sidewalks, but more of an office with some retail components. And then the lakeside, there's the commercial on the north side on the lakefront commercial, and the lakefront residential. Lakefront residential is the one that's under construction now. That's the Edge Home development. So anyway, these are the overall districts. The Lake Promenade, Geneva Park are some of the key open spaces that help to kind of frame the development within open space. Big open space on the north end, and then one running right through the middle. Like I said, so I'll go through this kind of categorically throughout the code. I didn't want to necessarily read the code to you because it's 100 plus pages, but we'll hit some of these highlights. And if any of the commissioners or council members have questions, I'm happy to we can discuss some of these things. So walkability, it's like one of the main features of this development is that it's highly walkable. And I'm going to keep saying that, it might get annoying, but just realize it's supposed to be very walkable. The highest level of walkability is required. Large sidewalks, park strips, bulb outs. You can see in these photos where the corners pop out. That helps to reduce crossing lengths and puts pedestrians in more of a visual location as they cross streets. There's awning requirements, so if there's rain, you can pop out of the rain. Street furniture zones, so that there's benches and places to gather. So the sidewalks in the town center are not just a place to walk, but they're supposed to be a place to gather, to meet friends, to hang out, to eat lunch, where you can have outdoor dining. And then obviously the promenade and then trails along the perimeter of the development. There's uses. I'm not going to go through all these, but there's a little bit of element of the Euclidean zoning where we do talk about uses, but these uses are more categorical. They provide kind of the overall use that's allowed in each of the districts. And then where this gets really into the form-based type of zoning is through the building types. So this code actually has a list of several building types, and each of the building types have standards and architectural requirements. And so as you can imagine, these are some graphics at the bottom of the slide that show, to give you a sense of what that would give you. So building facades that aren't blank walls, that's something that we hear from residents quite a bit is, why'd you approve that? There was a big blank wall facing the street. We want it to look more and more interesting. So that's what a lot of this does, is because part of creating a walkable experience is you create an environment that's interesting, that you want to walk by. On the bottom right, you can see storefront windows. There's requirements for those. So that as you walk, you can actually see inventory and you can see activity occurring inside. So it's kind of creating a connection between your walking environment and what's going on the inside of the buildings. You'll see like in these types of buildings, there's lots of fenestration, transparency of glass, undulation of the walls, unique designs. So that's what these building types call for. And then this kind of lists the different building types: storefront, commercial, civic buildings. So there's several different building types. And then each of the sub-districts, it shows where they're allowed within those sub-districts. So that's one thing that's nice about this is a code that actually looks at the form. So the developer, when they build a building, they actually would bring the architectural drawings into the planning commission, and you would be looking and making sure that they met the minimum requirements of those building types. So it's a lot different than if someone were to build around the megaplex where we have more general requirements. These are very specific requirements for window placement, location of entrances. So if you're a planner, it's fun stuff. If you're not, you're just like, oh my gosh, it's a lot to take in. The building types also get into what's called like an urban wall. An urban wall refers to a street where you enclose the street with buildings on both sides. Those are requirements so that you are pulling up the front facades of buildings closer to where the pedestrians are, so you're not walking through parking lots, and that you're able to walk directly into the building. You can see on the bottom right, parking is required if there is surface parking to be behind buildings. So the focus is on the architecture of the building. It's not on a parking lot. So there's requirements for transparency, for limiting blank walls. There's several different building type elements that each application will have to go through. Like we talked about entrance types, there's different types of entrances. There's a big focus on creating really nice kind of like primary entrances to buildings that face streets. Horizontal divisions of buildings, like the architecture needs to actually kind of specify from an aesthetic standpoint how buildings are split and how buildings are divided, and that's kind of getting back to getting away from big blank walls on exteriors. These are some of the graphics. The code is filled with these that show examples of what the building types are, and then the building types have tables that have all the standards in there. So I would highly recommend, especially the Planning Commission. I'm sure you've all looked at this, but that's something to dig into and to become familiar with, because as this builds out, we're going to become very intimate with all those little details of each building type. There are ratios that are built into the code, and so with basically the 5 building districts where you would develop, there are ratios. The VO, the village office, it does not allow for residential. The TCS, which is that red one where the arrow is pointing, it allows up to 80% residential. The TCMU is 75% residential. The LFC, which is the lakefront commercial, that allows 30%. And then the Edge Homes development, the lakefront residential, requires 100% residential. And so it's very important that you mix uses in these types of developments, because if it's all residential, then that takes away the walkability thing. Because if you have to get in your car to go get milk or to go get groceries, then it kind of defeats that purpose of having a walkable environment. So this is going to require some retail to be built into the fabric of the development and not just residential. So it's pretty interesting how it was laid out. So the council had a lot of they spent a lot of time kind of making sure that ratios were built into it. And then similar to building types, there's also street types. So it's very important that the public realm is also designed to enhance the pedestrian and bicycle experience. And so as you can see from these graphics, there's frontage, there's different zones of the public right-of-way. There's the pedestrian through zone, the planting zone. So street trees are very important. And there's a big section on plantings and the public landscaping. Is there a question? No. Oh, okay. Oh, sure. No problem. And then it gets into like the general street layouts of the site. We talked about bulb outs before. It requires refuge islands, and so if there's a really wide road, there needs to be a spot where if you have kids or someone who has some sort of mobility issue and they can't get across in time, that they have a place to stop where they're not standing right in the middle of traffic. And we've all seen that type of situation, and this code kind of anticipates that, and it says, okay, if you're going to have a really wide road, then at least minimum 38 feet, there needs to be some sort of refuge island for someone to be able to be safe in. And then each of the street types, including the promenade, that's also a street type as well as an open space type, because there are some parallel roads running along it. There are street types, so there's minimum widths, there's different things like that. And so each of the streets, Main Street, side streets, those are all the internal street system. They all have minimum standards that need to be met. And then there's the lakefront street, the one that's basically the extension of 300 West, which I believe is occurring right now with the edge of development. So with all that, there's also open space. Just like there's street types and then there's building types, there's also open space types. So open space, as we talked about before, is very integral to this development. The open space in this plan has been designed to really frame the development. So this development is built around not just the transit station, but access to the open space. And so, like just talking about the promenade, one of the great things about the promenade is that's our main entrance into the city if you're taking transit. As you get off, it takes you all the way through our downtown and interfaces with the lake. That's something that's very unique about this development. Is it's one of the only interfaces with a really urban development adjacent to a natural open space area. And so the plan really kind of anticipates that and is utilizing the promenade to that effect. On site, so each individual pad is required to have 20% open space based on things that the developer can do, such as providing amenities, dedications to the city for open space. The on-site, so each block can reduce that from 20% down to 10%. So the code goes through what those are. And so this is talking about the overall of the required open space. Bonuses in the form of open space reductions may be awarded up to 30% of the required open space. And then there's different elements that are pointed out. So to get a reduction, improving areas like the main intersection. So the main intersection for the development is the Main Street and the Lake Promenade intersection. And what it says is essentially providing the corners to be really enhanced, kind of like urban plazas adjacent to the building frontages, and creating a place where people can dine and eat and a place of gathering at those intersections. Things like that. If those types of intersections are enhanced to a great deal, then there can be a reduction in the on-site open space. That doesn't mean the promenade is reducing. That means like individually, if they're building office buildings and they have a courtyard, they can reduce kind of that private open space that's within their own block system. The town planner is given the ability to provide some reduction in exchange for lighting, public art, which is really important. And I know there's like the Heritage Commission has, they have a lot of interest in showcasing some of the heritage pieces from our history throughout the promenade. So things like that, bicycle racks, when they're the transit shelters, when those types of elements are enhanced and included, then the planners are given the ability to provide reductions in that regard as well. The code also anticipates parking structures and utilizing parking structures, because some of these sites are going to be built out to a pretty heavy extent, and where we can provide green space on top of parking structures. And so it allows for reductions in the form of kind of the surface top green space. There are in lieu substitutions for open space. And so under like circumstances like the promenade, and that's what we're doing tonight through the development agreement, the applicant is essentially proffering the promenade to the city through the development agreement. And that's a pretty significant thing that takes basically private land and turns it into a public amenity. And so there's the code is set up so it allows us to accept open space that can be used as public open space. That's a pretty exciting part of this code is it doesn't just have to be private open space. It can be public open space that we can all enjoy. And then there's also like cash in lieu. I mean, there's a ton of things in the code that are provided, but you can get, you can look at open space substitutions through providing cash to the city. Then the city can then use that to enhance open space and to make the open space even better. And we talked about kind of the land substitutions. So, as I mentioned before, there's also open space types. So the code is really great in that it actually specifies in some pretty good detail what the open space needs to be. And so this provides kind of the general framework of the promenade. As you can see, there's different sections of the promenade as it heads from the train station on the east side down to the lake on the west side. opening up and becoming a really great park. I know there's been a lot of talk about putting a large pavilion out there where we could have ice skating in the winter and yeah, like food or farmers markets in the summertime. So there's a lot of really cool things that we could do with the promenade. But in general, this kind of provides us the base level of improvements that would be included. Open space plazas. One of the things that they're required to meet the minimum open space requirements, the applicant has to follow one of these open space types. And so, where they have a block of office buildings or like an apartment complex, they can center those around a plaza area so that there's gathering places that are built into the framework of each block. And it provides the standards for those. Pocket parks are going to be really important in an urban space where you have little gathering places that you can access. And then, like we talked about, where you have residential commons and courtyards. So people on site can have open space right there. They can walk out and have some sort of amenity without having to walk too far. And then also landscaping is required. The project's pretty great because the on-site open space requirements don't include the park strips and and your like your street trees, and so there's a lot of vegetation that's going to be required. And we may need to look at some of these. The tree installation requires 20 trees per acre, but that does not include street trees. So it's and we have to be kind of careful because if you plant trees too close together, you can have some real issues. So we may need to kind of adjust some of these just to make it so it's more it's more functional. So we actually have spaces that we can utilize on site. But the project will have really great treescapes, and that was really anticipated for it. And then this kind of provides the overall requirement of the tree types. I know that when this was put together, I don't believe there was an arborist that's looked at it. We've analyzed the tree list into some detail at this point. And as you know, we do have the Vineyard tree manual. And so what we're thinking, because we really researched the Vineyard tree manual and made sure it contained trees that were drought tolerant, that wouldn't create a ton of maintenance, that provided a lot of shade. We want to make sure that we align this development with our Vineyard tree manual. And so we kind of anticipate making some changes or a reference from this list to our Vineyard tree manual. We may add a few in there. And as you know, the Vineyard tree manual allows the city engineer to look at like specific requests for trees that aren't in the manual, but still meet the general requirements, being drought tolerant, low maintenance, providing a lot of shade. So I know there's a lot, but I just, it's good for us to kind of run through some of these. So just bear with me. But parking lots are really important. There most definitely will be some surface parking. I know part of tonight is looking at working out some financial arrangement for structured parking. But when there is surface parking is required to be put behind buildings. So the main face of it is fronting the main street. But where there is a side, a portion of the parking lot is butting like a side or a portion of the front property line, there are landscape requirements. So the code's really cool in that regard, is that it provides a lot of tree and shrubbery to help screen parking lots. So it's not something that you would see just in a standard development in the city, but you're going to have some pretty nice surface parking lots if they're there, and that's a side. And then in the interior parking lot requires a lot of landscaping islands, and vegetation treatment. So there's like overall coverage requirement, canopy coverage requirements. And then garbage, and that's one of those things that you don't really think about, but the planning commission spends quite a bit of time doing site plans, talking about how do we screen the trash, and put it in a location so it's not going to wake up all the neighbors when it gets emptied. So the code anticipates that and requires screening of trees around dumpster and refuse areas. The general plan really supports this project. It was an important part of the general plan. So I won't go through every one of these, but I just wanted to kind of show you that the general plan really kind of anticipates a great investment. And because this town center project will help our lakefront. It's going to help promote a healthy community by providing a high degree of walkability. There are heritage goals. The plan anticipates putting a lot of heritage elements in the promenade and near the train station. So as you walk the promenade, you can get a real feel of what used to be here and also kind of where we're heading as a community. Parks and open space. I mean, that was one of the main elements. That's what frames the development. From an economic development standpoint, we look at this as being a really important part of how we're going to create a lot of jobs in our city so that our residents don't have to, drive to Thanksgiving Point or to downtown Salt Lake, but they can, have a high tech job here or college jobs, because we do have a really wide range of residents in all income levels. Transportation, this is a multimodal project. A lot of people don't realize, but the city is also going for light rail, not just front runner, but also light rail, which will meet up essentially at the same place, creating a true intermodal hub. So you have UVU that's on the east side of the railroad tracks and the town center on the west side. So light rail would come through the UVU side, and then the front runner station is on the town center side. And the idea is connecting the two with the pedestrian bridge. And so it'll be a true intermodal hub with buses and a high level of biking and walkability. Public facilities. I mean, there's a lot of these that it means. Moderate income. There's a ton of requirements from the state right now. As you know, if you've tried to buy a house, which a lot of our residents have in the last couple of years, housing prices have gone up quite a bit. And we've found that there's a pretty significant housing shortage for really all income levels, especially as as you're looking for starter homes. Those aren't as prevalent as they used to be. And so, providing a lot of housing options in the town center is a great way to try and provide housing for our kids when they move out, and they can be able to kind of transfer from an apartment to a condo to a townhome to a small house to a big house. And so that helps with that whole idea of aging in place, not having to move somewhere because you can't afford to live there. That is all I have. So I know it was a lot of information, and all I can say, if you really want to understand the code, you got to read the code. But hopefully this gave you kind of an outline of what the town center is supposed to be, what the code does, how it helps us to get there. And I'm happy to answer any questions, Christy, or
why don't we go ahead and we'll hear from Jake first, and then try to consolidate the questions. But if anybody wants to read the code, it's really exciting. We really love it.
There are a lot of pictures.
We love reading codes. Thanks, Morgan.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't get the opportunity to present to the Planning Commission very often, so thanks for letting me do this. I appreciate Morgan and Liz and all the work they've done in preparing that presentation. I know that's a ton of information, but it's really relevant to our discussion tonight, and it's important that everybody understands kind of the plan and the backing for what's going to lead the rest of the discussion for the evening, which is around the development agreement. I'm going to let Pete Evans with Anderson Geneva lead out on the development agreement, but just and I'll follow up with some comments. But we, as a staff, have looked into this a lot, and we've had a lot of meetings back and forth. I've met with all the city council members, all of the on the developer side. I've met with all of them, and we've discussed this at length. This is a big deal for the city. There's a lot in this plan. There's a lot of risk on both sides for both the city, the RDA, and the developers. I think that the plan that we're going to present tonight shares that risk equitably, and I believe that it also shares the benefit. So the city, the RDA are going to see some significant benefits from the plan. So without taking too much time, I'll turn the time over to Pete, and then I'll be here to answer some more questions afterwards.
Appreciate the opportunity to present tonight to the Planning Commission and to the residents. We're excited about the project. We're grateful for the time and consideration that we've been given from everybody at the city. We recognize and appreciate that this is a really important project for the city. We appreciate that this has been a lot of years in the making, that there was a lot of time and effort that happened before we got involved in laying out this zoning code and putting together all of the rules and the guidelines for developing this project. And we're excited to take those rules and to execute on what's already been approved and zoned for the project. And we think what we are presenting captures the vision that was intended when that project was approved, when the zoning was approved for this area. And we hope to be able to execute in a way that fulfills that vision and creates something of lasting value and pride for both us and for the city. So what I thought would make sense is to just introduce you to the plan that we're proposing, talk about the way that we're proposing to execute on that plan, and then talk a little bit about the reimbursement agreement and the development agreement. So this, just generally, this is the town center area. It's bounded by the railroad tracks on the east side, Vineyard Connector on the south, and Utah Lake on the west, and then comes kind of to a triangle at about 1600 north on the north end. This picture was taken a little while ago. You can see Main Street, or the proposed Main Street alignment was started to be cut in at this point, and some of the promenade area was starting to be filled with the ORA material from the north end. Just when you're looking at this, it's really easy to lose scale because it's such a big area. So this is a little over 300 acres. It's about 330 acres, which when you hear 330 acres, it's hard to really put that in perspective. And so we overlaid a few things just for perspective. This is the Daybreak community. So those are the lakes in Daybreak. That's their downtown core and most of their housing in Daybreak that fits pretty much all in the town center area. This is downtown Salt Lake City. And just for reference, that red shaded area up against the railroad tracks is the size of the entirety of City Creek. So it's a very large area. And most of the downtown core for Salt Lake fits in this area. So, and that just kind of gives you some scale and perspective of what we're talking about and the amount of space that we're talking about this development. So this is the proposed plan. The proposed plan, and I apologize, it's rotated 90 degrees, so you can either turn your head sideways or just kind of mentally adjust. But the proposed plan mimics the plan that's approved in the code very closely, except for a couple of distinctions. One distinction is that this has about twice as many roads as was proposed in the original approved plan in the zoning code. And the reason for that is walkability, and we'll get into that in a minute. And then secondly, it does change the village office here on the north end a little bit, where originally the, I don't have a pointer on here, but yeah, thank you. So the two blocks at the top were originally to the south, at the south end of that park. And so that park was the Geneva Park was all in the north end, and it was bisected by that road that goes out to the Vineyard Connector. We thought that it made more sense to consolidate the village office in between those two streets and consolidate the park space as one contiguous open space rather than have that open space bisected by a main road and basically split it up into two smaller parks. Other than that, the plan mimics very closely the original plan. A couple of things to note is the train station on the east. You can see at the terminus of the promenade on the east there. That's where the front runner station is. We've met with UTA and UDOT. They still say that they're on schedule to open that front runner station by the end of next year. And so we've been hard at work with city staff laying out some roads so that we can have those connections made by the time that front runner station is open, and we can have all of the facilities that we need on our side to facilitate that train station being operational. So the design elements that we looked at when we were looking at this town center area, obviously you have all of the design elements that Morgan just went over that are adopted in the code. And we looked at all of those elements to incorporate into the plan that we've made. But one of the big things that we looked at specifically was walkability. And Morgan said you'll probably get sick of him saying that. You may get sick of us saying that. Because when you look at a new urban area, walkability is one of the key things that makes that area viable and makes a mixed use project really work. And as Morgan was saying, the traditional model that the U.S. developments have turned into over the last 50 years have really been a separated use model where you have worship over here, work over here, retail over here, and housing way over here. And so it mandated that you had a car to be able to get to all of those functions. It also mandated that all of those functions were separate. And so it was kind of, this negative feedback loop working against walkability. Since then, there's been a large movement in the United States to get back to walkability and get to what they call, a new urban use, or what Morgan said, this form-based code, where instead of saying, okay, these uses need to be separate, let's look at what these uses look like and make sure that we're doing it in the right ways so that we're encouraging this walkability. So as they've looked at walkability, and they've looked specifically at quality of life, the United States cities that have the highest Mercer study ranking of quality of life also happen to be, not coincidentally, but they are also the most walkable cities in the country. And when they looked at new growth in urban areas, they're disproportionately moving to walkable cities. So walkable cities and walkable urban areas are growing disproportionately to cities that are not as walkable and not as well planned. So those were kind of the design. That was one of the main design elements. And Nate with Anderson Geneva is going to talk a little bit about what makes something walkable, because it's one thing to say let's make a walkable city, but it's another thing to say how do we do it.
Yeah, thank you for your time. Pete happens to be the smart partner in our partnership and the handsome partner, so I get one slide here. So I'll do my best. Some of you, I think Planning Commission about 8 or 9 months ago, you guys watched a TED Talk from a guy named Jeff Speck on walkability. I happen to come upon his stuff as, we do a lot of these master plan communities, and I was really impressed with the stuff he did. I wasn't aware you guys had watched that, and so he came to Salt Lake City for a presentation at Vivint Smart Home Arena for a bunch of planners. Some of you may have attended that. But while he was here, I shot him an email once I heard he was coming and said, hey, we have this project. We'd love to have you come and take a look at what we're doing. He took a look at our website and responded, I don't do what you guys do in a typical housing development. And we had to say, no, he said, your housing developments are great, but what I do is a lot different than what you do. I'm used to taking the main train station in Boston downtown and redoing it and making it more walkable. He worked with Oklahoma City, some of you may know. They've had a big push over the last 10 or 15 years to take some of the roads and turn them more walkable. He worked with the mayor of Oklahoma City to do that. So anyway, so he came down to our office and he said, I'm booked out for the next year. He saw this plan, he saw the train station, and he saw a blank canvas of 330 acres with the lake, and he said, I've got to get involved in this. So a lot of the things we've done here and that we're proposing tonight come from Jeff and a firm called DPZ out of Miami. They're the kind of lead urban planner in the world. And so we spent a lot of money and time with these guys. And, you know, they said when they first came, as we were talking to DPZ, like, why should we go with you? Because you cost a fortune. And they said, you know, there's a lot of local planners you have there that are good, and there's some regional planners that are also good, but all of them are reading our stuff and incorporating the stuff we're writing, and we're the ones writing the stuff. So, you know, with a blank canvas like this, with this much acreage, they felt like, and we felt like it would be good to work together on this. So I'll be brief here. The 4 things that make walkability is you have to have somewhere to walk. That's the most important thing. And like Pete shared a minute ago, if you only have housing there, and you have your ball fields far away from that, and you have your worship far away from that, and your work facilities far away from that, you have to have a car, and you don't walk. And so in this zone, and you guys were smart enough a few years ago when you designed this plan to incorporate all those things in the same area. So the most walkable cities in the world also have the most diverse uses close to each other. So New York is probably the most walkable city in the United States, and it has the most multi-use facilities all built into it. If you look at a zoning map of New York City, you know, they have the different colors for the different zones. It's like just
Confetti?
a million confetti. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. You want to finish? You can come finish this for me. That was good. So the second thing is you have to be safe and feel safe. And the number one determinant on being safe in a community is block size, which was very surprising to me. And so what we're planning here is a much smaller block than is normal. For example, a 200 to 400 foot block means you have a 2-lane city. A 600-foot block, like you see downtown Salt Lake, means you have to have a 6-lane city, and you have to have a flag and close your eyes and run across as fast as you can, like you know up there, to do it. And when you double the block size, you quadruple the number of fatal accidents. So safety is a huge component. It's not just you have to be safe, you have to feel safe. And part of feeling safe is being comfortable. And Jeff talks about how the comfortability of your walk has to do with evolution, and how all animals, they like to see their prey and they like to have their flanks protected. So that's why when you're walking down a street that has wide open spaces and there's no one around, you feel a lot less safe than you do if there's 4 or 5 stories next to you and there's a lot of people out there. And that's the last component of it, which is needs to be interesting. And the number one thing to make a walk interesting is to have different things and different architectural elements in there. But the number one thing that makes it interesting is having other human beings around. So the more human beings there are around, the more walkable, the more safe you feel. That's why if you go to New York, you know, if you have something that counts your steps, you get home and you're like, oh my gosh, I just walked a whole marathon today and I'm hungry. And I ate 9,000 calories and it's delicious. I mean, that's why you feel that when you're there. There's interesting, and you never really feel like you're walking that much until you get home at night and your feet hurt and you count your steps.
Thanks. Somehow I knew he would incorporate food into it. So this is just a quick diagram of different cities around the country. And it's a good illustration of which cities are walkable and why. And if you just focus on the bottom row there, in the middle of the bottom row is Salt Lake City. And so you can see the large block size necessitates really wide streets. It's not very walkable. On the bottom left of the bottom row is Portland, Oregon, which is universally held as one of the most walkable cities in the country, and it has a very small block size. And what those small block size does is it disperses the traffic. So it's not just that you are able to see intersections more close and you're psychologically tricked into thinking you're not walking as far. That's a little bit of it. The main part of it is that there's a lot more roads to take that same amount of traffic, and so the amount of traffic on any given road is a lot less, and so those roads are a lot more walkable and the crossing is a lot safer. One of the other main features in the plan is the promenade area. This is large green space, linear green space from the train station running east-west to Utah Lake. So there's a lot of great examples that we've looked at across the country for promenades that have worked. Portland, Oregon has a great one, the North Park blocks. That is a great linear space going through the middle that's surrounded by retail and mixed use. You can kind of see how that works with the buildings around it. Boston has a great one, the Rose Kennedy Parkway, that kind of goes through their downtown and creates this meandering pathway that provides access, walkability access to basically everything downtown. They have another one on Commonwealth Ave that terminates into a great park at the end of Boston Public Garden. So the promenade is going to be a large focus of ours in our design. Obviously, as we go through that design, there will be a lot of opportunity for the Planning Commission to be involved in the programming of that promenade. You'll have design review. We'll have submittals over that promenade. The way that the zoning code is written right now is that as these blocks develop out, whoever's developing the adjacent block to the promenade would develop kind of their half of the promenade as it goes through. Our design philosophy is a little bit different. Our plan is to develop the promenade all at once, so that there's not a patchwork quilt of disjointed development as you go up and down the promenade, and some of it done and some of it not, and some of it works together and some of it doesn't. So our plan is to develop the promenade in its entirety, and make sure that that's cohesively planned and programmed, so that we end up with a design element that's a magnet. And just kind of as a design philosophy, our goal in designing this community isn't just that we have a place where people are using the train station to commute from to somewhere else. Our goal is to create an environment where people are getting off of the train here as a destination because of what we've built with the promenade and the downtown center and everything else. And they're using that mass transit to get here because we've created a magnet, not just using the train station to go somewhere else and parking here to leave. The building types are very similar to the building types you would see in these other, urban downtown areas along promenades. So a lot of the code requires, as Morgan was saying, a lot of design elements and a lot of very highly stylized design elements in this downtown area. There's a lot of requirement for retail, especially on the promenade and some of the main street and intersections. And so there'll be quite a bit of this that will be, the building itself will be mixed use, whether it's retail on the first floor and office above it or residential above it. There will just be a lot of mixing of these uses instead of separate uses that would require a car to get in between them. So these are just some examples of the design firm that we had do the land plan. What we asked them to do was design the land plan given the existing code and buildings that they had built elsewhere in the country that would fit into the code, and then do some massing studies to lay in those buildings into the town center area to make sure that we could actually build what we were proposing. So these are just some creative ways that they've incorporated. For example, green space, you can see that picture on the bottom left where they have a Z-shaped building, and they've incorporated both a town-facing green area and then on the backside a water-facing green area. And then that building is a mixed-use building in and of itself. This is a mixed-use building area where they have a retail area and then some office and then some residential all together and all sharing parking, because parking is counter-cyclical. You have retail and commercial uses that use parking at a different time than residential uses parking. So you can overlap a lot of those parking uses and not use as many parking spaces and parking structures. Again, just another example of one that they've done over in California that we liked, that would fit in well here. And then this was a good example of one that they did at a train station, where they've brought the building all the way up to basically the train station plaza. The first floor of this building is retail, which provides a really nice space for the train users. They have a coffee shop and a little retail shop and a little deli in there, so that as people are waiting for the train or they're on their way home, they can patronize that retail area. But it also just creates a really unique experience that just doesn't exist on our mass transit system right now. This is actually a building here in Utah that they did. That's a mixed-use building. And then just another example of a great plaza area that we thought would be a great model for a reception area coming off of the train. So what we tried to do in the development agreement that we're proposing is to create a plan and a development agreement that incentivized more walkability, more commercial and retail than is planned for in the original plan, and a better open space and quality of life than we think was required under the zoning code. So we think with the development agreement that we proposed and working, countless hours with staff, that it does these three things. It basically creates the downtown area that was envisioned for the area with even better walkability with the smaller block size. We end up with more commercial and retail and a lot better open space, and ultimately a better quality of life, not just for the people that live and work in that area, but for all of the residents of Vineyard that go over and enjoy the amenities in the downtown area that will be created. Happy to answer any questions that you have about the plan.
Thank you. Thanks for all the work that's been put in on both ends of this project. Any questions to start us off from the Planning Commission? Yeah.
I've got several. I'll start with you since you're up there already. One is, in addition to the agreement, you are proposing amendments to the zoning code as well, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, so the amendment to the zoning code basically has to do with that park area that I talked about before. So the original plan had those two very northern yellow blocks.
I can point to it.
Yeah, would you?
So it's moving these two office acreage spots used to be right here. So there was park here and here with this road bisecting it. And it was actually, I believe it was Morgan's idea that having a park here with a really busy highway here and a busy road here with kids and whatnot, it made more sense to swap these office areas for this office area, same acreage, and then put all the park in one spot. So that's well, and one more thing, there was another little plaza right here in the original code that was about 1.5 acres. Now that we swapped these out and this park got so much larger, everybody felt like it made sense to make the promenade larger down here. So swap out this 1.5 acres for this 1.5 acres. And that would also provide space for the town to build a city hall. So civic use down at the end of the promenade to kind of tie in, because the programming that DPZ has talked about for the promenade, which all of us will have to talk more about in the future, but they've talked about up here being maybe more of your shopping retail area, here being your entertainment retail area, and here being more of your cultural, civic, entertainment, more leisure hanging out area, so that there's different components to the promenade, so to get all of those additional uses.
Okay. And then I guess a follow-up, Morgan, for this, for our decision makers' edification and for the public's. Obviously, a landowner can't just unilaterally change zoning. It goes through a public process. So can you take us through what would need to take place in order for the town center zoning code to be amended?
Sure.
What the city can do unilaterally, or what they need to work with the landowner on?
Yeah, so there's different processes. So tonight, in the development agreement, the code was written really well to provide some flexibility through the development agreement to allow for changes to the code like this. And so by approving the development agreement tonight, that would change the 30-acre park on the north from being two, basically, I think it was like a 13 and a 17-acre park into one cohesive park that wasn't split. And that can be done through the actual development agreement without going through a full town center change. Now, I believe later on when Jeff Speck does his design, there may be more changes, but that actually can be approved tonight, and that's allowed through the code. It allows for amendments that way.
But substantial changes such as building heights or parking requirements, those types of things would go through a different public process for a zoning code change.
Yeah, they could. It doesn't require though. But the planning commission, it's essentially the same process, because the planning commission would review a change to the code, but you also are reviewing a change to the development agreement, and so it would go through the same process where the planning commission makes a recommendation and the city council would ultimately approve it. So the process is the same. It's just two different tracks. They're called different things, but.
And then enforcement of the code. Could you speak to what the city's role would be in ensuring that the code is enforced, whether that's through the site plan with the planning commission, building officers? Could you
That's on you guys. The planning commission plays a critical spot in this. As you know, like a couple years ago, the city council gave that authority back to the planning commission to approve site plans. So you don't recommend on those, you are making decisions. So what we would do is we would comb the code and we'd look at the building types, the open space types, the street types, and you would ensure that those elements that are being proposed at that time meet the standards of the code. Once it's built, or once it gets approved by you, then it's up to planning department, the building department, the public works with the streets to make sure that things are implemented as they get constructed through the process. Then once built, then it's code enforcement. McKenna's going to go out there and she's going to ticket people for parking too long. Or no, I'm just kidding. but yeah, there definitely would be some code enforcement on the back end once projects are built.
Thanks.
So.
I think that helps just to get that on the record
Great.
for everybody.
Thank you.
Then the last thing I have before anyone else speaks, I just want to request that we get these slide presentations, both of them, added to the minutes so that public can view those.
Will do.
Thanks.
This may not be the appropriate time or location to talk about these details, but walkability, pedestrian accessibility. What thought has been given to pedestrian bridges rather than surface walking, but to surface pedestrian bridges, either building to building or street to street? That would be one question. And then secondly, about the front runner station itself, I'm not sure if this is the appropriate time to bring it up, but I know that our goal as a city is to have it a very unique front runner station, not to have a platform. And I'm just not sure if there's any preparation to talk about that tonight or not.
Okay, so your first question on pedestrian bridges, we brought those up specifically with these walkability experts, and they greatly discourage pedestrian bridges. What they encourage is dispersion of traffic to make streets more walkable. And so if you consolidate traffic and then create a pedestrian bridge, think Bangerter Highway, you end up with a very unwalkable community. If you create smaller block sizes and more surface roads, but you disperse the traffic so there's less cars on each road, then you encourage walkability. There are places where I think pedestrian bridges are appropriate. So for example, there's a pedestrian bridge planned at some point over the train tracks to connect the UVU side, where the ultimate light rail and track station drop off will be, with the front runner station on the east side, so that you have a true intermodal hub. But as far as the internal community itself, the idea is to create a surface walkable community and design it that way, rather than consolidate cars and then try to figure out ways to get pedestrians not to interact with those cars by avoiding them altogether.
And how about building to building bridges? Minneapolis, downtown Salt Lake,
Yeah,
where they've used that concept.
yeah. So the architects that we're working with, I think they'd be totally open to that. I think where they make sense, they'd be great to use, and especially in an environment where sometimes it's cold.
It's cold?
Yeah, started this week. I wasn't ready, but and then your second question on the front runner station itself, we agree with you wholeheartedly. We've been meeting with UTA and UDOT, which there's kind of a funny handoff there between UTA and UDOT on who's doing what in that process. But we've been working with them to the extent that we can be involved in that process, making sure that it's not just a concrete platform with a range structure. So they're just starting that process of figuring out what that station will look like, and we're definitely making sure that we're inserting ourselves in that process.
So what's the appropriate place to insert the community's desires in that? I mean, I know that you're there.
I think it's through planning staff, because they're interacting with staff as well, and they can relay those interests.
So, Tim, to answer maybe in a roundabout way the question that you're asking, in the budget for the reimbursement agreement that will be presented to the RDA board, the developers are front loading about $10 million for the promenade. Part of that will be that plaza area where the train station interacts with the city center. So all of that design will go through the site plan process with the planning commission like it typically would. And in the development agreement, we've also included a portion of that to say that the RDA board, the financing, will have final design approval for that area. So it is addressed in the development agreement that will have some interaction with them in the design of that area.
Could you guys also speak a little more about the development agreement?
Yeah, is there any aspects?
More specifically what we'll be talking about?
You want me to talk about the finances, like the RDA side?
Yeah.
Okay. This is kind of a unique meeting. The Planning Commission probably doesn't get involved in finances very often. But so I wanted to provide a quick overview of how the RDA functions. Maybe it will. There we go. So really quickly, RDA, if I say RDA, it means redevelopment agency. It's allowed under state code. It's a financing mechanism that's available to cities. This is the boundary for RDA. You can see it encompasses most of the city. The color on the map indicates phasing. So our RDA began in 2011.
Can you put that in presentation mode so we can see it?
Oh yeah, sorry. Our RDA, so you can see it extends south to the bottom corner of that blue area. Well, yeah, purple. That is the edge of the Water's Edge development, and the blue in the the bottom corner at the right side is 400 South, and it extends all the way north from that area. So that's the boundary of the RDA. It began in 2011, and the end of the RDA is 2046. Each phase is triggered and is active for 25 years. So we began triggering phases in 2011. The orange in this map and the yellow in this map have not been triggered yet. Everything in the RDA has to be triggered by 2021 because of that 2046 deadline. It's just we send a letter to the county and let them know that we're triggering a phase. And so,
can you define what trigger means?
What triggering means is, let me see if this is now. Oh yeah, this is great. Right into it. So the way the RDA works, when you trigger a phase, what that means is you're pulling tax value that would typically go to the different taxing entities in our area, which are the county, the school district, the water district, the city, all of that, the incremental value that's created within that project area is distributed in a different way. So if the RDA didn't exist and we had a single family home that was worth $350,000. Without the RDA, the city collects $710 in property tax at our current tax rate. With the RDA, the city collects $177. So then the question is, why would you ever approve an RDA from the city perspective? The RDA, if you put the RDA in place, the RDA collects $1,600. So that really starts to build some value as you get a lot of units and a lot of commercial development within the boundaries. That RDA becomes a powerful tool. And so this next slide will show you how the RDA has grown. These are the revenues over the last 5
Jake.
years.
I don't know if it was clear that it is what is built on the property by the trigger date. That is what is collected from.
Yeah, so when you trigger, that's when you start collecting that increment. So in phase 4 and phase 5, the orange and the yellow on that map that we showed you, those haven't been triggered yet. So any of that value that's been created within the RDA is being distributed the way it would normally get distributed. Once we trigger that, all of that value will be captured by the RDA and will be distributed out with that 75% coming to the RDA.
But anything built in that zone after the trigger would then be part of that.
Yeah. So
Correct.
all value created over time within each of those phases is then it's cumulatively brought in. So you can see the value within the RDA has grown as the development within that project area has grown over time. Does that kind of make sense? I know it's a pretty complicated formula. So moving on, if there's no questions about how the RDA works, we looked at the development agreement, and the development agreement states that there are backbone infrastructure pieces to this project, and the backbone infrastructure pieces are there's an exhibit that talks about it, but it's the roads, the main infrastructure roads. There are going to be alleys and lanes and things like that aren't included with this. But the roads, whatever underground utilities are included within those roads, the promenade, and any parking structures. Is there anything else? Am I missing anything? Those are really the keys. There's a lift station that will be needed in the town center as well. So those are the 4 main pieces of infrastructure that's going to go into the town center reimbursement agreement that are included in the development agreement. So what that looks like is the developer is agreeing to donate the ground for the promenade, to donate the ground for Geneva Park, to donate that 1.5 acre piece of ground for the future city hall or the extension of the promenade, to upfront all of the cost for all of those infrastructure components. So all the roads, all the underground utilities, the lift station, and any parking structures that are built. The developer has said that they're willing to upfront those costs as long as the RDA is willing to reimburse those as backbone infrastructure.
So explain what upfront means.
Upfront means the RDA doesn't have any money right now to build a park. We couldn't go into the town center and build a parking structure. We don't have the funding for it. The real value in the RDA comes over time. So as you've seen that grow, for instance, the first year in our model that we're using, the first year of increment that's built in the town center is, I think, $250,000. Year 25, the increment that's anticipated from the town center alone, that 330 acres, is over $9 million. So you can see that value really escalates over time. So we don't have a lot of money up front, and so we need reimbursement agreements similar to what we did in Water's Edge, similar to what we've done in other areas in the city, where developers bring money in up front, they install the infrastructure, and then we reimburse them over time based on the increment that they create.
And
so
with an interest, 7.5%.
there is an interest component to this as well. So the Water's Edge, it's similar to the Water's Edge agreement in that regard. So, but it's tied directly to the increment that they generate. So it doesn't escape and pull increment from any other areas. It's just within the town center. Okay, So specifically on the town center, what does surface parking look like in the town center? I have, let's see if I can get out of here. I have a spreadsheet that we've been using as our town center analysis that I can pull up here. There we go. Okay. And then I'm going to pull this so I have those questions back up here. Oh, okay. Now I can work with a dual monitor. All right. So you can see here on this spreadsheet, this is the development that's been, so we have I'll run you through the spreadsheet really quick. We have over time value analysis here that shows the amount of residential units and the commercial space that they're anticipating creating. So you've got 5,200 residential units, 1,000,008 square feet of non-residential. You can see the cost assumptions or the value assumptions here. If we go over to a parking analysis, based on the assumptions in the model, if you have 5,200 units, 1,000,003 of office space, 529,000 square feet of retail, you would need 19,691 parking stalls. That equates to 142 acres of parking. So a 330 acre site, 142 acres of parking. So that's what the town center looks like if you surface park it. So we started looking at structured parking. So what does structured parking look like? And that is right here. So when you start looking at structured parking, the cost to put a structured parking lot per stall is more expensive than the additional units you create of residential. And so the residential development will never support a parking structure. And if you look at a commercial development won't support a parking structure right now either. And so the value that you create through structured parking is through these shared parking agreements like they started talking about. So if you look here, you can see a residential development, 600 units, has a parking stall requirement of 1,200 parking stalls. The annual increment generated is 586,000 for a total increment over 25 years of 14 million. A parking structure costs $18 million. So you never generate the money back, even without an interest component, even without time value of money. It never makes sense to do parking. And then if you look at commercial development, it's the same thing. 5 million in increment, 7.5. If you look at a shared parking analysis and you reduce the parking requirement to 80% because of the offsetting uses, you get closer to where the value's there. So you can see the total increment generated, total cost for parking. So that's why we started looking into structures, whether or not they're feasible, whether or not the RDA should get involved, if it's a good use for RDA money.
Sorry to interrupt you, Jake. Did you do any analysis on how many parking structures would cover those acres of parking you were talking about?
Well, it just depends. You can build a parking structure that's 600 stalls. You can build a parking structure that's 1,200 stalls. So, you've got 20,000 stalls that are needed. Not all of it is going to be structured parking. And especially in the beginning, because they are so expensive to build, we'll phase those in as they make sense. So I've got Laura Lewis here. She's a financial advisor for the city with Lewis Young, and she worked with me on some of these numbers. She's here to answer questions that you have that I maybe can't answer. But one of the things that we talked about with her is, has this been done in other cities? Does it work? She has some specific examples from cities that she works with. She works with cities across the state that have financed parking structures. I don't know if you want to come up and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background with that.
That's great. I have the two questions he just said.
Okay.
As has been done in other cities.
Okay.
Has it been successful?
So, my name is Laura Lewis. I'm the president and principal of Lewis Young Robertson Birmingham. This thing has a horrible echo. Is that better? Here, we need to be taller. I've been in public finance for almost 30 years, which I hate saying because it makes me sound so old. And serve cities primarily in Utah. We probably serve 60-70% of the 25 largest cities between me and my business partner. So we work a lot with cities, in economic development. Most recently, I have worked with two cities with parking structures, both in the south end of Salt Lake County, Midvale City and South Jordan. So if you know the development of Midvale City, if you get off at 72nd and head west, there used to be a Superfund site, not unlike some of the property you had here. And so they had an RDA set up, generated a lot of tax increment. Of course, they wanted the taxable value of that commercial property, but the developers are hitting the same thing. If we build an office building, the tenants expect some stacked parking, or else we have to take acres and acres of land to do surface parking. And so there we actually used tax increment, and we some of the tax increment coming off of that project. And we did a financing for them to actually construct that parking structure. I don't remember, there's a number of businesses out there. I don't remember which two businesses, use that stacked parking. And then another one that comes to mind is in South Jordan, right off of 106. If you get off of 106 and go a little bit west and then turn right, there's two new office towers there. Same thing. They knew that they needed, South Jordan was really interested in having Class A office space, and so that they could compete with sort of the downtown element, if you would. And they said in order to have Class A, we've got to have stacked parking, but even though we're building Class A because we're south of downtown, we can't drive the rents in order to pay for the stacked parking. And so similar, exercise. It was within an RDA. We used the tax increment, and in that instance, the city actually had excess RDA funds, and the city did a loan effectively gave the developer, the cash to build a portion of that stacked parking structure, and then they used increment to repay that. So this isn't uncommon. I know my business partner, Jason Birmingham, has worked on others, so it's certainly not uncommon. So I got that question. I don't know that I got your other one.
So it's been done in other cities, of course.
Yes.
And has it been successful? Are they happy with the agreements they've made? Has it turned out the way they wanted?
Happy with the agreements. They've been able, in South Jordan, they were like, we've got people clamoring to rent this space, but we have to, we can provide parking. And my understanding is that they've fully occupied that building, and they are now looking to build another one and have the same challenge. The cost of that parking structure has gone up, and one of the things that South Jordan is, and it sort of does by a policy perspective, it's not mandated, is that they look at what tax increment. So the analysis that Jake just showed you, and they basically said we'll agree to tax sharing up to X, right? So my advice would always be that you set some type of cap on what that sharing arrangement would be. Certainly there are benefits in having the commercial property as opposed to a sea of tar. Once the RDA goes away, then that taxable value all stays. And that's very, very beneficial. When you have that kind of density with commercial and residential, with office and residential, that will really help shore up your commercial. And that is a benefit to the city because it generates more sales tax opportunity. It drives that sales tax growth. Also, franchise fees, when you have density, franchise fees come off of your gas and electric bills. So, it will drive that, and that isn't, lost to the increment, during the 25 years that increment will run. I had one other point, and now I've lost it.
What is the typical, what's the typical size of structured parking stories?
I would say 3 to 6. There's a point at which, and I don't remember, I think it is beyond 6, it gets really expensive just from a load, load bearing kind of thing. Oh, I know my other point. So thank you for asking that
You're
question.
welcome.
The state about 2 years ago put a type of financing in place called CPACE. It's Commercial Property Assessment. Commercial Property. I don't remember what the acronym stands for. The financing method that the state has tried to promote, and it has some challenges from a finance standpoint, but I'm going to get to my point here in a minute. One of the things that they want to promote is energy efficient builds. And so these CPACE financings can be used to help commercial entities finance anything that reduces the environmental burden. So if you use energy efficient water coolers and heaters and all of that, you can finance all of that with CPACE. Interestingly, because I kind of did this head scratcher, the dog tilted head of like, what? In our state law, under CPACE financing, you can finance stacked parking structures. And I was like, why? What? Help me understand how that, sort of helps the environment. Why is that energy efficient, right? And then I was educated. If you have a sea of black tar, you know how hot that gets in the summer, right? That sun hits that, it's hotter than heck, right? And that heat comes up to the building, makes it, so that the equipment, the HVAC has to work harder to cool that building, and they deem that it's bad for the environment. So environmentally, I'm just telling what's in the state law. I'm not an environmental expert, but environmentally, the state has determined that stacked parking structure is better for the environment than a sea of black tar.
So Laura and I ran through the analysis. This pro forma that was put together by the development team. We ran through all the assumptions that were made, and the one thought that we had was that they're really aggressive. The benefit to the city for that being aggressive is that they're taking all the risk. The RDA only reimburses based on the value that they create. So if they don't create the value as quickly as they're showing they do, then they don't get reimbursed. So we're comfortable with that aggressive schedule. There's a lot of risk. There's a lot of things that can play out over a 20-year or 25-year project. But the way that the tax increment deal is structured hands most of that risk off to the developers.
So the way I'm reading this agreement right here, it's not necessarily green lighting or guaranteeing a parking structure by any means. That would be, the decision would be made by whom and when on something like this.
So it would be up to them at this point if it made sense in the market. So the last thing the RDA wants to do is force something that doesn't make sense. And so requiring a parking structure wouldn't be the best thing for the RDA because it handcuffs the development. So the developers will, on their terms, be able to put these parking structures in when it makes sense.
But it's not anything that the private market would dictate. It would need public financing is what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, maybe in 20 years, you get. So let me back up one step. As you guys look the code over, if and this is for the RDA board as well, if the RDA board's uncomfortable with the reimbursement agreement, both the developers and us as staff are comfortable with the town code the way it is, and they're comfortable moving forward without structured parking. And I think structured parking will come in. It's probably just 20 years down the road, 15 or 20 years down the road. And so what we're trying to do with the RDA incentive is utilize their upfront money to kind of kickstart all of this so the development happens faster. You're not doing infill like the rest of the valley's doing right now. Because right now you see structured parking going up in already existing areas. So in order to avoid that, we need RDA incentive to kickstart it. And then with that triggering, like we talked about, 2021 is the deadline for the RDA. any year that we don't have development, so if there's an acre of ground in the RDA boundaries that doesn't have development in 2021, that increment's forever lost. We don't ever recapture that. So that's kind of what's, the economy's strong right now. The RDA is at full value. There's a lot of components that are kind of pushing us to get this town center going, and we believe at a staff level that that incentivizing that through structured parking is the most important incentive that we could provide to the developers in that area.
So when decisions are made about whether to move forward with structured parking, those plans and things will come through the Planning Commission for approval and review, right?
Site plan
And all of that. Okay.
But we won't determine whether or not there needs to be a parking structure. That is something the developer will determine. So is there any way to stop them from just making as many parking structures as they want? I just mean theoretically we would want a downtown corridor of just parking structures, correct? I mean, I understand no one's going to do that, but is there a way to restrict, or how do we?
I haven't thought of a scenario why you'd want to control it, so we didn't look at it from that perspective. So no, I haven't.
Are you asking financially? Oh, sorry.
No, I'm just wondering what the process is when a parking structure is going to be built. We're just allowing them to determine it's time for another one.
Yeah, I think from what I've understood is if the market and they find tenants that require it, then they'll build it and they will put that money in up front to do so.
And we are trusting that is the correct decision to be made, is to build a parking structure to meet.
Yeah, we're essentially saying you as a business and a developer and someone who's going to be a landlord will know that market better than us. And I think that's what Jake was saying up front, is instead of requiring a certain amount,
right,
we're saying you take the risk, and if you can build it and you create the increment.
Right, because you built in that.
Yeah, instead of us taking the risk and saying, well, okay, build it, and then we have to pay you.
So that's the built-in cap right there.
Yeah.
Is the risk factor.
And we also would have the form-based code to fall back on too, so that it's not like every block is just a concrete parking structure. We would still, that would still enforce the streetscape, design that's intended by the plan.
And you're going to see, in my opinion, that you're going to see the majority of the parking structures in the most dense areas, which would be the town center, by the station and the mixed use, right? That's where it's going to be. I think the office park and things like that eventually could have parking structures, but that's further north and there aren't as many people there at both times of the day.
Does the code
Let me comment on it,
yes,
if I understand your question too. What is important to remember is our code will require them to have a minimum number of parking for whatever they're building. The code does not require them to use parking structures. Our goal is to encourage parking structures because we think it benefits us in a couple of ways. One, it frees up more land for more units, more commercial, and therefore more tax increment, more benefit. Two, it enables us to increase the parking over our minimums where we think it needs it, because as all of us know, parking, especially with the rail station, parking could become a problem outside of the normal code thing, because people are going to be attracted to the rail station, and we need to make sure that we can park them without interfering with the residents and businesses that are naturally going to be there. So we want to encourage structured parking, and that's why we're willing in the RDA to pay part of that cost. If we weren't willing to pay it, as Jake was expressing, it won't pay for itself, and so we believe the developer's incentive would be to avoid it and use surface parking as much as possible. Now, they would have to build that in conformance with the form-based code, the streetscape, the landscaping, but they're going to have to park it, and so we're going to get more concrete and less other things, if that makes sense. But it is important to remember we can't compel the surface parking or the structured parking, so we want to incentivize the structured parking.
So this agreement only is for structured parking. If they put in flat parking, that is also included. It's not included.
We have defined structured parking.
And is that language that's all in the code?
We've defined structured parking to be one of those elements of backbone infrastructure that benefits the whole community rather than the project. Our RDA theory is on infrastructure is that we will reimburse that infrastructure that incentivizes development and benefits the whole community and not just a project. And so Main Street, everybody drives through. The street to the train station, everybody drives through. The main sewer lines, the main water lines. Because this is such a large area, it can't be developed like we would often do, where the landowner is responsible for all the infrastructure. If that happens, the vision of the downtown as a unified, planned whole thing would never work, because there is no one developer that's going to buy this and build out all of that exactly the way it is. And so the purpose of the development agreement in this respect is to provide the backbone infrastructure that benefits the whole community, incentivize things that we would like structured parking, and incentivize things that we'd like the promenade, like the parks, like those things that unify the downtown and provide a benefit to the whole community. But on just the legal part of the parking structure, it's important for me to make sure that everyone understands is without the incentive, they would be doing it voluntarily. And our analysis was they're not going to be incentivized because it won't pay.
One last question about structured parking. Does that also include underground parking? If a structure is being built and they put in parking underneath, is that considered a structured parking?
Yeah, the agreement, I think the terms of it right now include that parking structures may be, that structured parking as we've defined it may be below or above ground.
Okay.
If I recall right.
And I'm assuming that would mean anything that's more than one level.
Yeah, it has
So
to
if they
be
put
multi-level.
one level underground, is that still structured because it's...
That's not the way that we read it, and we can clarify that in the agreement.
I just think we should make sure that our
that's not
our language
how
clearly
I've
defines
understood it. Yeah.
everything.
So one of the things that we talked about with the developers was clearly defining what the term structured parking means, because it's not a definition in the agreement right now.
Perfect.
So really quick, last point. The main concern that we had at a staff level was we incentivize parking structures. They build 2, RDA reimburses 100% of them, and they never build anymore. And so we talked through a ton of different options of how to incentivize them to make this as successful as possible. And so the presentation that we'll make to the RDA board will get into, it's a tiered reimbursement. So they get a certain percentage based on X number of stalls. So if they hit certain thresholds, the percentage of reimbursement increases. That the way that we've built that in makes me feel more comfortable that that this will be a more successful, more downtown urban project.
This is probably more complicated than we can talk about tonight, but I had a really hard time understanding Section 6C, the ADA reimbursement for backbone infrastructure. There was a lot of language in there.
Yeah.
That I had a really hard time following, and I'm just wondering.
There's an exhibit. It's Exhibit E.
Okay.
And that's included now. So we have an exhibit that clearly defines the backbone infrastructure.
Because just walking through the words, I had a really hard time.
Yeah, and we've been working on some modifications for that and clearing all of that up. So
is there a way to summarize somehow? We talked about benefits to the city and benefits to the developer. Is there some way we could just summarize what those are? The 3 or 4 for the city, the 3 or 4 for the developer, and how all of this might look?
Yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
I can express what I see in the agreement going through the benefits to the city and the developer as far as I see. First, the benefit to having a development agreement just in general. A lot of people say, why do we want a development agreement? Now, the benefit to the developer for a development agreement, other than the RDA side with reimbursement, is it enables the developer to vest their rights in the zoning ordinances as it exists today for that period of time. So that when they're doing a large planned development like this, it takes the risk out that one election cycle from now, a new council appears and says, we don't like what the council did 4 or 6 years ago. We're amending your zoning ordinance, and as you go forward, you're under the new ordinance and the plan gets half done. So that's a major benefit to developers who are doing large projects.
So the agreement gives them some guarantee of continuity.
They're being vested in the code as it exists now for the period of the development agreement.
So
now,
this is the time to make any changes.
Right. And that's why it's our code. We created this code specifically for this purpose. Now, our worry at the city, at least my worry, was we spent all that time and money and created this code to build this downtown. We also benefit from the development agreement because we want to vest the city in the plan that we envisioned. Now, they're not required to build the plan under the development agreement. They can choose not to build anything or the plan. So that's benefit to both sides of the agreement in general. That's why people do development agreements. Now, the other benefit of the development agreement is we have some input, as you've noticed, in the pace of development for our purpose. They're going to do the promenade up early instead of late. Certain roads are going to go in early to benefit the train station that don't necessarily benefit them, but benefit the whole town. Though that's a benefit to the city to take the decision on the pacing of those things out of the private property owner's hands, and in exchange for the agreement, give us some say in that. Now, the other benefit to the developers, obviously, is to, for their purposes, to freeze in the financial obligations that the RDA is committing to, so that when they go out and market and sell, they can represent to potential buyers what's going to happen, and that's a big benefit to them. I don't know of others other than it enables us to incentivize structured parking, takes that decision out. We're getting a commitment from them for a certain sum of money for a park that benefits more than their downtown. We're getting from this dedication of open space, some dedication of some roads we don't have to buy that are going to be built early, the main streets. That's a significant benefit. The primary benefit, though, is to make this town successful, we've got to get the RDA completed. To get the RDA completed, this is the key piece. As you know, a lot of us have been around since it was just the Gammon Farm and 150 residents. We need the downtown done as we planned it and designed it for the kids that are growing up here, to make sure there's a downtown, a tax base, money to pay for the fire department, the police department, all those kind of things. We can't just leave it empty forever. The city won't be financially successful without it, nor can we do it without it being planned, or else we're just going to end up with the cheapest thing that they can sell and make money on and walk away from.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay, if there aren't more questions, I would you got the public here, been listening in for a while. If there aren't some more questions,
I've got one question for you. You said that you've been working on some things in the agreement. So is there a different agreement other than what's in front of me now?
There's a redlined copy. I don't know if you've seen that yet or not.
I've got the ones that were sent out.
It talks mainly. I can talk through the specifics that we've changed. It talks about process. So it involves the city staff, the RDA board, and really clarifies how we want to be involved. We're involved in the planning, like pre-construction process. We're involved in the construction process, change orders, payment requests, and then we're involved early on with the financing. So all of the invoices are delivered to the city after the payment requests have been approved. It really clears up a lot of those concerns that we had, and then as we meet with the RDA board, we'll clarify the tiered structure that I talked about. So We moved those districts around like they presented. We just wrote that into the development agreement so it was really clear. So we weren't just relying on the district map to define what the changes were. They're written out in the agreement.
Okay. Just personally for the rest of the commission, I would be very uncomfortable approving anything other than what I've read line by line. And if the council after that has read some of those red line changes and wants to add those, then they can. But I'm sure you've represented it well, but I'm not going to approve anything that I haven't put my eyes on directly.
I think too, along those lines, all of the red lines are your red lines in that document.
Okay.
None of them. That may still be the same, but I just wanted to point out it's not like we put red lines in and said.
Yeah, that's true.
So
Yeah.
every red line that you have in your document came from Dave.
Yeah, so they presented the agreement that you guys have in front of you. We have been working with them. We didn't want to come to you saying this is what we think and we're going to fight with them. We kind of have been working really closely together to try and come up with a plan that works for both sides. The red line agreement has some small modifications like we've addressed that.
Okay. That makes sense.
Their process and procedure from the city side so that we don't get in arguments with them about when we pay money, things like that, what our role is in approving and inspecting. But we have no problem with you from the city staff side with you making a recommendation on the agreement you have in front of you to the city council.
Yeah, that's all I would be comfortable
because
with doing.
you have the substance in that agreement in front of you, but we have added clarifying language so that to avoid future arguments.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I didn't have time to meet with all the planning commission members. I've been meeting with all of the city council members going through those red line changes and asking what they wanted to see as far as the reimbursement application. This is kind of a unique situation. As we dove into the code a couple weeks ago, you guys know we found out that this needed to go to the planning commission as well, and that was kind of unclear to us to begin with. And so I've been really focused on the RDA board, making sure that they understand the agreement.
Jake hasn't slept in 3 weeks,
Okay.
so.
One other, so I agree we need to get to the public hearing because we've got people here that will ask some questions. Inevitably, additional questions about parking will come up. I've spoken with some residents. I probably share a different viewpoint on how to solve parking issues than some of the residents, which is fine. I think it's fine. So in my opinion, if 2 stalls are built per unit, that's fine as long as only 2 cars are there per unit. So what, if anything, can be done on the developer side through the agreement, through ordinances, through the city enforcement to ensure that number is not exceeded?
Yeah, and that's why I express our city concern with the parking is really we're creating a destination, which means we have to have the equivalent of public parking provided by somebody that doesn't burden the residents and the commercial area. We have to anticipate that someone who doesn't live there is going to drive their car to the promenade or the train station. That's why the incentive for additional parking spaces. I like you, say, so what, why, 2 parking places ought to be enough for most people who live in a 1-bedroom apartment. But 2 parking places per 1-bedroom apartment will not be enough if someone comes and takes one of those to ride the train to Salt Lake. If that makes sense. And let me just share with you the substantive red line changes other than just the typos so that the public isn't thinking we're hiding anything. One of the main ones was we added a subparagraph in that just says annual reimbursement payments shall be made by April 1st of each year. The available tax increment shall be reduced by the property's pro rata share of any mitigation payment due to the Alpine School District. Mitigation payments are calculated annually. The pro rata share of the property shall be calculated by dividing, and then blah, 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 that kind of thing. So, it's not like it has anything to do with the zoning of that. The other one are things like the city staff shall be included in the construction process, including design, bidding, contractor selection, and change orders. And then if punch list items are not rectified by the developer within 90 days, the agency may elect to use available tax increment to rectify remaining punch list items. The rest are just typos. So, that's why nobody was rushing to deliver changes. They're just...
Great.
I
One
just-
last question from Tim, and then
I
we'll
just have
move.
one last question. It's on section 7C, and it deals with the 1.25, well, $1.25 million payment. And I'm just wondering, how is that amount derived? And is there an total estimate for build out for the promenade?
That entirely depends on the development, what it looks like, how we design it. The 1.25 was an estimate of what base improvements would cost. If you put grass, sprinkler system, sidewalk, that was the base improvements that we were planning for.
But it was derived as a negotiated amount. We would have liked lots more. They would have liked nothing. And so we negotiated the base thing, and then because obviously we're not designing the promenade without your input, without the public's input at some later date. They're not going to take the risk that we designed this to be gold bricked and platinum fenced.
Well, some of that's useful.
And so we did agree that they ought to be responsible for basic sod, sprinkler system, sidewalks.
And because we don't want sod across the whole thing, we did a dollar amount rather than saying we want this installed. So they're going to contribute that amount that's not reimbursable. The balance of that would be reimbursable depending
So when
on
we
the site.
design that, it will be up to us to design something that we can afford if it's over and above the 1.25 million.
Yeah, and the numbers that are in the model are around 9 million in addition to that 1.25.
All right. Thank you so much for being patient. I know we've lost a few friends tonight, but we'll go ahead. If I could get a motion to go into a public hearing, because I do need a motion, right? Yeah. Do I have a motion to go into a public hearing?
Yeah, I make a motion that we go into public hearing.
Great. Do I have a second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. If you will limit your comments to about 2 minutes. When you come up, state your name, where you're from, your neighborhood's helpful, and also I'd like to invite our other commissioners that are in the audience if you had any comments to come up as well.
I'll let you know when you have about 30 seconds left.
Thank you.
This is difficult because many of us senior citizens have been sitting
Will you
here for
state
2
your
hours
name?
and we feel like a lot of this
Excuse me?
could have been committed to item number 3. My name is Randy Gray, and my wife and I have lived in Vineyard for a little over a year. I lived in the Valley of the Sun for 44 years and saw my breath for the first time last winter. I'm here on behalf of the Water's Edge 55 plus community. And while we've heard a lot of constructive remarks tonight about parking and destination parking, we're here specifically, and we understand the focus is on the future development agreement pertaining to the town center and the light rail. But we have had North Mellor Drive turned into a parking lot because of the preserves. This notion that you can have 1.8 parking spots dedicated for 5 or 6 people, and mind you, in the preserves on weekends, there are 5 and 6 people. I don't want to play Dr. Phil, but there's lots of significant others that visit on college weekends in the preserves, and they park on our street. One of the most cogent questions we have is, how is it that 800 North in the Vineyard Connector Loop, as wide as it is, the city can declare no parking, but on North Mellor Drive, which is narrower, people are welcome to park on both sides. We've got a serious problem there, and on behalf of all of us who live there, our comments are devoted just to those, because we're not destination parking for those who are walking over to the preserves. Those who live there, that's different. But for those of us who have to put up with that and can't get our garbage picked up because people are parking out there, we can't even have street curb cleaning because of everything that's going on. Our snow removal. So we need help. The focus is on future. I like what I've heard. I'm sure some of our senior citizens do. But we have to do something about the existing. There's been great mistakes made, and we trust we'll do it. My last 15 seconds I'm going to share with all of you that I was privileged to work with Dustin Dart Industries. Many of you may not know that name. He was the co-inventor of Tupperware. He was appointed by President Reagan to be one of the co-authors of the Americans with Disability Act. There are egregious mistakes in terms of crosswalks, accessibility in our community, and those need to be corrected. So while the focus is on the future, I love what I've heard, we also have present concerns that have to be addressed immediately. So on behalf, and I'd like all of those from our community to stand who have been patient to just even stay here all this while. We're talking about people in their 70s and 80s and 90s, and how do they, in addition to mobility impairments with their grandchildren, walk across to the parks on Main Street? There's no crosswalks. There's no signal lights. We need that corrected. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. We appreciate your comments. Does City Council want to address some of these issues as it's more of a council?
I believe that they kind of tied it into the current plan, and I think we're facilitating public parking and also really focusing on that walkability that they're concerned about. I did have an opportunity to speak to several members in the crowd about some alternative ideas for what the staff and the city council can work on.
I'm talking specifically about the parking.
As well as the planning commission to deal with their current problems. So if each of you could write your name on the paper in the back, that'd be wonderful, as well as your email. And then we'll have people reach out on some of the issues that you talked about tonight. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Did we have anyone? David, did you want to speak? Great.
Hi, sorry, David LeRae, Holloway Road. Just want to speak about some of the issues we're talking about in this development agreement, locking down the code as is now for the purposes of development. If we do that, there are some other issues in the code that seem not to work. We're talking about developing mixed-use areas in the town center mixed-use area, and also over near the station. And yet we're talking about allowing 75 or 80% residential use in those areas. If it's not a very good mix, if we want an actual mixed use area, so we're not getting much business, and it seems to me that sort of defeats the purpose of having a business district up there if we're having it mostly residential. It also adds to the congestion we already experienced. We just heard about from the folks on Miller Drive. Several of the folks, as I've been out talking with people, several of them have told me they're having some serious parking problems over the northern tier of our city right now, and they've been trying to find places to park, and the city keeps taking them away from them by restriping the roads and so forth. And I understand that we don't see it that way, but they do. And so they've also been hoping for parking solutions to be put in across the connector, and I've learned recently that's not envisioned in any of this, so that you should be aware that any parking solutions you come up with will need to take into account that you're going to have some people parking over there from the south, just south of there, because that's the only place they have to park. Those apartments were built probably with less parking than would have been advisable. Granted, it was the city at the time felt that was appropriate. We since learned otherwise. It's not worked well. We're a college town. We're going to be having more and more students come in with cars. If we develop the town center with all affordable type apartments and housing, we're going to get more of the same. One of the reasons that Portland and New York work so well is you have a mix of different kinds of uses. They're not typically students in those areas. You have families, and you have all sorts of generational, and so you're not going to get, if you don't have a mix, you're not going to get the kind of population you expect there to be able to support the businesses you want there. Seems to me we ought to do some thinking about that before we lock that code down. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
I have a question about that. My name is Julie Fulmer. I am a resident. I I would like to ask, what are the ratios for normal transit-oriented developments? I believe that there are lots of college towns that do have, that live around TODs. I had asked, just out of curiosity, what that mix is, because I think that'll answer that question.
So you're asking about other cities that do have schools? Is that what you're asking? What they're
No, I'm asking for the TODs. So any transit-oriented development like ours is, we have college people here, and we may have college people in the future, but our whole city is not just a college town. It is a mixed kind of more development. But to David's point, discovering what the ratios of a TOD are and how those are workable. It might be that most TODs have 80%. They might have more, and what becomes viable there.
If I can just address that a little bit. So I've reached out to Dr. Reed. I'm going to mess up his name. Ewing. He's one of the foremost transportation planners in the country. And he's at the University of Utah, and he has a really interesting study that he's been conducting over the last several years, and he's one of the only people that's actually looked at parking requirements for TODs, and a TOD is a transit-oriented development. Thank you. So it would be a development like this that's essentially on a transit line. And it does vary. So if I'm going to get those results, I'd be happy to forward them to the Planning Commission and to the City Council for their consumption. One thing that it does show is every TOD is very different depending on its adjacency to transit, what type of transit, what where it's located in a region, the size of it. But I think that this would provide us at least some data. There's not a lot for mixed use and TOD type project studies in terms of parking requirements and ratios. There's a lot of the like the single purpose type studies for individual business types. So this will be some pretty interesting data, and if I can, as soon as I can get it, I'll forward it over to the City Council and to the Planning Commission. That would provide us at least an idea of, I believe he's done 10 large TOD sites.
I'd like to see that.
Okay.
Couple of questions. Moderate income, that word's been used tonight, right? What is that defined to be? And then we're talking about percentage of residential, 75, 80%. What is that a percentage of?
Sure. And that might be something where our rep from Lewiston can help out. My understanding is moderate income is considered the 80th percentile of what of the median income. Yeah.
Moderate income is defined by the state legislature and the state code, and it's a moving number. It's housing that is affordable by people who earn 80% of the median household income for the county in which you live. So there's a figure that's generated for Utah County as to what people make. It's a calculation of what housing costs are. Moderate is that is affordable for 80 at a rate of 80%.
So the term
or
of
less.
80% of that. So the term affordable housing is often used.
Affordable is like 30%.
Okay, and high density often translates into moderate income.
It could. High density could also be very expensive, depending on how it's built and the size and what the apartments are and that. And so they don't necessarily equate. If you try to buy a moderate income apartment in downtown Salt Lake, I think you'll find that you can't find one unless it's one that's being subsidized by Salt Lake City.
But here in Vineyard, as we start to build,
might be here in Vineyard, we would expect that those things would qualify as moderate or better income. We would hope.
Okay. And the percentage question, 75% or 80%, what is that? Of what? It's 75% residential, 80% residential in the different use areas.
Yeah, so that's square footage.
So the total square footage
The
available.
gross square footage. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's where what those ratios are.
Pete, did you have something? Yeah.
So, Pete Evans, Julie, I think your question was, what is that ratio, or what does that look like? Parking requirement look like in other TOD zones? So there's a great study that, if you want to reference it, it's called Empty Spaces, where they looked at a lot of TOD areas across the country. Basically, what they found was that in TOD zones, by and large, they're overparked. So, and that's even with a reduction on the required parking in a transit-oriented development in their zoning codes. So, for example, we're required in a residential unit to have 2 parking spaces per unit. The experts that we've had look at that say that's way too high, but we're not asking to change that ratio because we understand parking is a sensitive issue. I think as this development builds out over several years, we'll get a lot better feel for how much parking is actually required given the transit nature of the development. What they show basically in their study is about 33% or 1/3 of the trips that would ordinarily be taken by a vehicle are taken by other modes of transit. And so they basically are saying that in these TOD areas, if you use the same parking requirements that you use in a traditional development, you'll have about 1/3 too many parking spaces that you're paying for that you don't need.
That are vacant.
That are vacant. Yep.
Can I clarify my question?
Yep.
So that is good to know.
But that's not what I asked.
But what I was really saying was, right now the current ratios between, and I think if this is right, I'm echoing what you're saying, was that you've got an 80% residential that's coming in and a 20% economics. It's not necessarily about parking, it's about the people there and if the ratios need to be moved out of there, so dropping it down to like a 60-40. I wanted to know what a typical TOD has as far as residential that makes it workable. So oftentimes people think if you have more economic development, you're going to have a better success, which sometimes isn't the case. When I was looking online, it looked like the ratios were divided by the different types of transportation, and I wondered if we knew all of the different aspects of what makes 80% good, or if we needed to knock it down. So is it if you have a train, bus, light rail, or what it is that makes 80% the right number in that small area, 70%, 75% in that larger area, and if business actually needs some of that ratio in order to function properly?
That's a good question. So when Jeff Speck and DPC looked at our zoning code, and so we asked them to analyze that and say, are these the right numbers, or are these the right mixes? The only comment that they had, they thought that the ratios were where we needed to be in the town center station and the town center mixed use. They thought the only opportunity that we ought to look at for changing ratios was in the village office, and they felt like that they felt like it was a missed opportunity not having any residential in the village office area where you could also share parking with that office area and activate that area economically as well, instead of having an isolated office park area on its own. So the 80 and the 70 they thought were very, very appropriate given the transit nature of the development. The village office they thought should be higher than 0.
Yes.
My name is Hector Hernandez, resident. I guess a lot of people's main concern is the parking, and I know we're talking about the parking this evening in the town center. And I guess I have a few questions if I can remember them all. For a 600 space garage, we're talking about $9 million. Obviously, that's all the money in the RDA right now. For the future, and I don't know how it works here, so I come from a parking background. In New Jersey, you don't build anything, apartments, retail, anything else, unless you build a parking garage or a parking lot. So I'm not sure quite how it works here. I guess I have a question to whoever can answer it.
my first question would be, if we build a 600 space garage, who's exactly paying for that? I wasn't quite sure. And are the businesses, the retail, the residents, are they gonna be part of reimbursing the city residents for that? In New Jersey that happens, so retail, commercial, anybody who shares that parking structure, that all gets paid off over a 20 or 30 year period through whoever uses it. Is that planned? Is something like that planned for the town center? How are we going to pay for the parking other than just the developer putting up the money and then us, the city, just reimbursing it? That's my first question.
Great, Nate, thanks.
Do you want another question first?
No.
So the thought is in the agreement that we would front all of the costs for this, and we need to generate roughly in the estimates we've run with Zions Bank and that Lewis and Young ran with Jake, is we need to build roughly $1 billion worth of projects in the town center area to be able to reimburse us for the projects we're proposing. And so I think at the end of the day for us, one of the benefits I think for the city in this is like similar to what happened in Water's Edge, where we went in, we put all the roads in, the parks are going in, we're crossing our fingers that the housing market continues to stay good and houses continue to sell so that we can get reimbursed for those costs. So at the end of the day, we'll pay for those, and then if we generate the tax increment sufficient enough to pay us back, then we would get reimbursed for those structures. But if we don't build enough increment in that just in our area too, so that's important to note. If we don't build anything, it's not like we're taking increment from other projects in the town that are going. And then what's beneficial to both of us in that scenario is we're incentivized to start building as fast as we can so that we can create as much tax increment as we can sooner, which in turn, in the end, when the RDA goes away, the town is left with a much larger tax base than it would be if we just didn't do any incentives at all and we just built at a normal pace like we would if there's a downturn. Maybe we build slower, but in this scenario, if there's a downturn, we're going to want to take cash we have in other places and continue to pump it into this site so that we can create the value so that we can get paid back for these items.
So Hector, to answer your question as well, if they only build one 600 stall structure, the proposal that we have for the RDA board would be it's a shared cost, so they would get reimbursed a percentage. If they increase that, if they build more, so that the downtown becomes more viable with more parking structures, they get a higher percentage of that reimbursed.
Now, am I correct? Did you say we needed 20,000 spaces eventually? Was that correct? Somewhere around there?
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Okay.
19,000.
Not all of that will be structure park.
Not all of it. Okay.
Yeah, because that number's near $300 million.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
And to avoid confusion, to answer one of these other questions is the parking structure issue is separate from the parking requirement. If someone comes in with a development, they are required to provide the minimum number of parking spaces for that development, just like in any other one. We're encouraging parking structures as part of that cure. We anticipate getting more spaces by us participating, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So an office building comes in, we calculate they need under our code 1,000 parking spaces. Some of that or all of that may be satisfied in one of these parking structures, but some of it may be outside the parking structures as part of that too, as the site plans come in. So we'll get at least the minimum parking required by the ordinances and more through this parking structure system, hopefully, to alleviate that kind of thing.
And I guess my other question would be, so the parking or parking structure or surface lot will come and be ready by the time the development is finished?
Yes.
Okay. Because obviously in Vineyard here we have a huge parking problem. You know what? That's all for right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Hector. Do we have any other public comments tonight? Great. Then do I have a motion to go out of a public hearing?
Yeah, I'll make a motion to close the public hearing.
Great. Do I have a second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, great. At this point, we've had a lot of information. Do we have any more? Does anyone have any more
I
questions?
have a few more comments.
Great.
Just a few different comments, I guess. One is getting to David to the point that you brought up about the mix of housing. I don't know, so it was good to hear what the right mix of housing to commercial uses is. But I do know from what I've studied and read and seen that you do want that residential component to make sure that it's a 24-hour neighborhood and people don't leave. And so, as long as we're looking closely at what those ratios are and make sure we don't overbuild the residential and underbuild the commercial, I think it's great. I know we have a lot of multifamily already in the city, but that's a place where density makes the most sense is right next to the front runner station. And then the concern that was brought up about the safety of walking in our current streets. One of the questions that I wrote down that I know is not going to be addressed in the master developer agreement, and it's a concern I've had and discussed at different meetings as we've been looking at the town center. But I think as a city, we really need to look at how is our city connected to the town center. How do people that live in the neighborhoods, how do people in the Water's Edge neighborhood connect to the town center? Because we have this basically a highway, right, that's going to be coming through from 8th North, the Vineyard connector, that cuts off a lot of the residents from the town center. So how do we safely, if we're building such a pedestrian-friendly, vibrant town center, which I'm very excited about, and I support and believe in a lot of the principles behind the town center. I'm very excited about it. But I'm a resident of Water's Edge, and I'm thinking, well, how can I safely get with my family if we're going for a bike ride or walking to the town center? I know it's not part of this plan, but I think it's something we really need to look closely at as a city, because I do feel like there are gaps in our pedestrian experience in the city right now. And in Water's Edge, where I live, I know there are a lot of areas where there are not safe crossings. There are not there are places where we have not balanced well, I feel like, the safety of pedestrians with automobiles. So I thought that was a good concern that was brought up, and I do have questions about that. I think we'll get into those details probably as the plan gets implemented and as those plans are brought before us. One of the areas of concern I've seen before is, how does Main Street interact with the promenade? And so I'm curious to dig in on that detail. I think it should be a surface crossing. I know there's been talk about a bridge. I don't know if Tim was in favor of bridges or not, but I agree with what was said. I think we want to make everything surface level and prioritize pedestrian crossings as much as possible. I feel like I had another question, but I think those were the main things. I think a lot of my questions are going to come as the details unfold. Generally, I'm very excited about the principles behind what's being proposed, and didn't really have, from my end, I don't have a whole lot of other concerns.
I just had a general thing. In number 3 under agreements, it talks about the donation to the city of the promenade acreage. And then it says the city will assume full responsibility for ownership and maintenance after acceptance of same. And it seems like in the past we've had some differences of opinion about what is acceptance of full construction, or when is it time for the city to take over. And I'm just wondering, is that going to be an issue here that we could anticipate and maybe make it clearer? I just don't know.
If you look further down in the agreement,
I didn't look any further.
Yeah, so that was, we collectively, I think, have had a lot of frustration with that. These are the same, we're working with some of the same individuals that we did on the Water's Edge development. And so collectively, we've been dealing with that issue right now. And so one of the things that is spelled out in this agreement is a better process for how we finish a project. So we'll have a meeting where we come up with all of the punch list items. they have a certain period of time to complete those punch list items. And if they don't complete those punch list items, then that available tax increment that would be there to reimburse them is used to complete the project. So there is some additional protections there to make sure that those projects are completed in a timely manner. The RDA doesn't assume or the city doesn't assume the maintenance until they've been accepted. So there is that piece.
Okay, so there's a protection there for
Yeah.
assuming responsibility.
You guys, Nate and Pete, do you agree with that, what I've said? Okay.
Thanks.
I thought of one other little comment I was going to make, sorry. If back to making sure the city's well connected to the town center, getting the parking issues, if I, who would live a half a mile away, if the safest way for me to get to the town center, the promenade, is to drive and then park next to it, that further exacerbates the problem of the parking. So I think in this whole parking discussion, we will help the parking issue if we connect our city well to the town center, so citizens, residents of the community do not have to drive to the promenade.
So there's a regional trail that goes underneath the Vineyard connector that will connect the Water's Edge residents on this side underneath there. Oh, sorry. And then also there's a underpass on the Vineyard connector on the promenade side on this side, so you'll have that regional trail that's down there that will come in underneath there. The big thing that we're working on and with Julie and staff and everybody is to see if UDOT would be willing to trade the Vineyard connector right away that they currently have and put it on the other side of the tracks, so that road becomes less of a giant regional highway and becomes more of a walkable community, because we agree we're working on that. They own the current right of way, so whether or not that happens, we don't know, but that is something we're working on. And so with those current trails, that will help a ton, but ideally we can get that Main Street area a little bit more walkable. And then we're also talking about with some of these scooter companies and things to have some accessibility from the train station down south and some of those other type of options.
Sounds great.
I think I sort of echo what Jeff said about how I am really excited for this project. I think that a lot of thought has gone into it. I know a lot of planning has gone into it and a ton of work by staff and the council and all the rest. But I also know that I'm going to have a million questions when we get to the site plan and design phase, because that's where the rubber is going to hit the road, and I know that we'll have a lot of questions about that from there. So, but that's all I had for the rest of this.
Yeah, just my 2 cents here. Focusing on the task at hand, which is the master development agreement. The agreement, in my opinion, is fine. It sounds like what most of the questions surrounding this relate to the actual zoning code. So I would be comfortable making a motion with the agreement, but encouraging the council to look at those ratios, and not so much parking requirements on commercial or retail, but potentially with residential. I was sharing with one of our residents here. I was reading an article about a company that worked with cities, and the CEO had a quote that was a little disturbing, but probably true. It said, "The law was not what was written; it's what was enforced." And I think, in my opinion, the parking requirements and minimums that we have are sufficient if enforced. If there's only 2 people parking in an apartment, then guess what? Then there two parking spots is sufficient. So I think the enforcement is the key to this. If it's not enforced, then yeah, it's probably not sufficient, and we've seen that already. So that's where my concern is, and I don't have a concern with our current code or this agreement. My concern is how diligent are we in following through on enforcing what we've got, and that doesn't just stick with zoning requirements. I think it's with anything the city does. If we're not going to enforce it, let's not have it. If we're going to have it, let's enforce it. So those are my thoughts.
Great, thank you. I too am, of course, very excited probably everyone in this room is, to get going on the city center. It was interesting. Jeff Knighton would be like this. When Jeff Speck came, the first thing he pointed out as the major flaw in the entire plan was the UDOT road. And I would agree that it would be a shame to have all of this money, all this time, and all of this heart being put into this project to have that be the one thing that kind of negates all this good work. So I would definitely encourage the council and Julie and everyone who's working on that with UDOT to stress how much we all feel that having that be a slower road is crucial to the success of this whole project. And it's great having those connections, those trails, but Main Street has got to get, if we can get Water's Edge to not park in downtown as least as possible, is going to be crucial to the success of that project. So I feel like the changes that they're asking for with the park make sense. I think putting that land together and not having it cut by roads makes sense in the development agreement. I'm excited about the plan for the more walkability, and adding more roads. And I think we've talked about this ad nauseum tonight. Does anyone at this point have a motion in any capacity? Oh, actually, I did have 2 more points. Sorry. I would feel that when we do, I would like to have the language in the code more specific about defining what a parking structure is. And I would also be interested to know what they're anxious to get building from what I'm hearing. And I would love to know what the first part of that is. And do we have any kind of guarantee on what that is?
So the current plan is to start on a commercial office building right next to the train station and a residential building right next to the train station, with the only caveat on the commercial building being if Front Runner for some reason slows down on their development, the commercial office building really needs Front Runner to work right now. So the plan is we feel like that's still on track. That's one of the big reasons for expediting this the last few months when, Jake's on his 8th monster over there of the day and fall. Sorry, Jake, I didn't mean to do that. Yeah.
That's Tice's.
Oh. So it's to get that road going into the Front Runner station right away so that they can't use that as an excuse to say, oh, we didn't, everything slowed up because there wasn't access, so we pushed it for another year or two, because it's really critical. The timing component of the RDA here is so critical that we really need to get building fast. So
I would just stress that I think the whole city would appreciate seeing commercial built first of those buildings, so that when people are coming to look at what we're doing, they see that commercial infrastructure and not going, oh, more housing. Okay. All right. That's the end of my comments. There are a number of motions you can make, so if anyone has one.
Well, let me try with a simple one. So I make a motion that the Planning Commission recommend to the City Council the approval of the Town Center Master Development Agreement.
Oops. I second.
Oh, great. Great. Are we all in favor?
Can I make it counter proposal? It's not that different, honestly. I would move to approve or recommend approval of this master development agreement as written that we've seen. I want to make that clear because I just want to make sure that's there. Also with Christie's stipulation that there's additional language around what constitutes a parking structure, and pass along a recommendation to the council to look a little closer at the ratios of residential to commercial.
Is there a second on the second motion?
I'll second the second motion.
Perfect. All in favor?
Aye.
Second motion.
Of the second motion.
Aye.
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 Aye. Great. I believe that brings us to the end of our meeting. Yes. If anyone would like to stay, we will, after this meeting, I think we should take a few minutes to stand and stretch, and then we will move on to our...
Line up at the bathroom.
Yeah. I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I will, but we're
When
going to do
she's
the
ready.
special session, right? We're not skipping any of the other meetings on this page? Okay. All right, do I have a motion to adjourn then?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thanks.